Protocol 1, Article 2, freedom for education. This only implies a right to be educated freely, meaning it's a negative right, at least superficially, meaning without the state giving out any rights as a starting off point is fine. Technically within the convention, a country could offer absolutely zero education, and that would be fine. The only way that they would then be made under possible scrutiny for this article is if they try to limit others' rights. Now, with that said, I should also add, it's due to historical and diplomatic reasons. Historically, because when the convention was being made post-World War II, primary school was usually the highest entry level that they would give out as a standardization. Also today, there are over 40, almost 50 states that are members, meaning that it's not going to be guaranteed that every country offers the minimal standards that, let's say, the 27 or 6 countries of the EU could. It's important to think of these things. I'm pretty sure the standardization of the EU, there's not even an equivalent of another 27 countries in the world that could accumulate the same type of quality of education. That is my educated guess, but I would have a very hard time finding that many sovereign nations at the same time in the same organization having standards which not even this protocol and article could sufficiently regulate, because most countries don't have the resources. Now, in doctrine, this usually comes down to questions of lacking. Looking at the countries and saying, okay, they're poor, and therefore we need to give them more options. Meaning, doctrine is not going to give you the thread which leads you back to colonization. It's not going to explain how the EU profits and monopolizes multinational companies and resources into becoming pretty much exclusively westernized. Now, this doesn't as much apply today due to Arabic and East Asian developments. However, continents such as very much in most alignment with what I'm saying, it's Africa. North Africa less, then you have further down where it gets worse and worse. And the conditions, specifically in South Sudan, man. Now, this is going out of topic. It's important to remember when they're talking in your doctrines about the fact that the EU or the ECHRs has these standards which other countries can't meet. This is not a coincidence where two countries or two places in the world at the same time are having two different circumstances. The EU is built upon the fact that some countries are poor, specifically even countries from the ECHR. Elevated thought to bring you guys to the realization that these are facts. This is how it works, and it's important to remember. Even though there might be these principles may be found as diplomatic leeways, which they are, aka the margin of appreciation, they're also a consequence of being able to act white saviorist almost in a then quasi-constitutional level, and pretty much saying, you guys are with us in this convention which brutally generalizes rights, which, yes, by the pre-World War II standards was incredible, but by today's standards, especially Scandinavian standards, it's pretty mid. Meaning, the ECHR both is a standardization of rights for countries which do not protect themselves good enough, but it's also a way of complying to how situations are today, making it seem like it's fine, and also that it is not systematic, which it is. Moving on. Should a service exist for everyone, then Article 14 can be applied in conjunction with Article 2, Protocol 1. Best example is treatment of Roma students. This goes back to what I was explaining then, the fact that some nations, they can't provide these things, but the concept of having an education still needs to be provided. Protections. What do I mean by this? I mean, there are things that are guaranteed to the average individual. Certain things that by law is supposed to be given by everyone, by the principles of rule of law. If these things should exist as a right, if a country should choose to give people a free education, then everyone has the right to these things. And this is where Article 14, which before I wrote incorrectly, Article 12, it's Article 14 in conjunction with this article would work, because the only way to argue then is not through asking, do I get to have an education? It's asking, do I get to have an education while everyone else also gets to have one? And do I get it in the same fair way? Roma students is a good example. I don't have any case law for this. If you guys want to look it up, general truth, people should know about. Roma's, for instance, the most prevalent example is of the genocide of World War II by the Nazi regime. The second largest group after the Jews was the Romas, and they're usually understated in the numbers and the tolls of deaths. I would put them alongside with the fact that Polish people died in general. A lot of Polish people died. Moving on. Folgeo and others v. Norway. Philosophical convictions, aka accusements, must be based on democratic standards, meaning arguments such as human dignity, for instance, cannot be argued. Democratic standards is something that is standardized within the convention. This is why it's more okay than arguing for something which technically is more sound, because arguing for human dignity is better. However, within democratic standards, you can find leeways which accomplishes diplomatic standards, meaning it's not technically that it's based on democratic standards, it's based on diplomatic standards. Because as you can see, arguing in any sound way outside of arbitration that human dignity is not the best way to go forth within a convention of human rights, well, you're going to lose that argument. So if you want to make yourself less frustrated with the logistics, call it a diplomatic compromise rather than a democratic standard, because it is not a democratic standard to say that it's not in alignment with human dignity. Lotzi v. Italy. Crucifix was banned first according to Article 2 and then Protocol 1, that is, due to the fact that it was in classrooms. This was first banned then, but then later on reopened with 8 nations bringing in amicus curiae, which pretty much means the friend of the court. And in this case, then you have a quasi-constitutional court being upheld with several member states. And these member states then function as the amicus curiae. If I understand correctly, being a friend of the court doesn't automatically mean that you have to be a nation. I'm pretty sure these things can be used in applications to national law, to national courts. Meaning you could probably have a friend of the court within, let's say, a Swedish court, Norwegian, German, Spanish, whatever. As you can see, this could be a very good demonstration of why we have the margin of appreciation, because situations like these happen. We're 8 nations out of the 46, I think. And we're like, hell no, we want to have our crucifix. That's our right as a nation. That is our margin of appreciation. And the court seems to be open to these things. They're like, okay, we'll even reopen a case and we'll change our minds. Because the margin of appreciation, when outright used by the nations, or not outright used, but when nations outright say, this is within our own national perspective, meaning within our own margin of appreciation, and they even say that you did this to another country, we're not going to like that president, let's take it back. Which also goes back to the fact that the ECHR has very weak case law compared to the EU and Sweden, and I'm sure every other democratic nation. But here you have an example of where that isn't the case. Why? Well, I'd say most likely because the margin of appreciation in this case is very direct. Having a crucifix in a classroom being decided within Italy, one of the most Orthodox countries within Christianity in the world, literally where the Pope lives, meaning it's also Catholic, but it's also then Orthodox Church, but also the Orthodox Catholic Church. Having that nation not be able to apply their right of having a crucifix in the classroom would pretty much mean that every other nation is not going to be able to argue the same thing. Because then the court indirectly says that a crucifix within the classroom is something which moves beyond the margin of appreciation, which obviously they took back, purely based on response.